Hi all, welcome. I'm Dr. Emily Ritter. I'm an assistant professor of political science at the University of California, Merced. And this is the online peace science colloquium where peace scientists from around the world present new ongoing research and get feedback from important scholars around the United States and the world to improve their papers and to share our work as much as we possibly can. Today, we will be hearing about buying influence, a survey experiment on the logic of aid allocation in conflict-affected countries. This will be presented by Susanna Campbell, who is an assistant professor of political science at American University, and Gabriele Spilker, who is an associate professor at the University of Salzburg. We will be joined today by hopefully 4 discussants. We have 2 that are good to go, and hopefully 2 more that will join us very soon. First, we have Matt Winters, who's an associate professor of political science at the University of Illinois. We have Stephen Chaudoin, who is an assistant professor at the University of Illinois. So we have Illinois represent today. Go Orange. And we will also hopefully be joined by Simone Dietrich, who is an associate professor of political science and international relations at the University of Geneva in Switzerland, and Suparna Chaudhry, who is an assistant professor of political science and director of the Reif Center for Human Rights at Christopher Newport University. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Susanna and Gabriele, who will present to us for 15 minutes.
Great. Thanks so much, Emily. First of all, thank you for this great opportunity, and thank you to our excellent discussants for taking the time to do this. We really appreciate it. So as Emily said, the title of this paper is now Buying Influence, a survey experiment on the logic of aid allocation in conflict-affected countries. And the basic setup is that increasingly there's acknowledgement that there's a relationship between aid and conflict. That countries that are affected by violence, this is from the World Development Report 2011, are those same countries that have very high poverty headcounts. And so these countries seem to be stuck in, as Color said, this conflict trap and unable to actually break out of the underdevelopment conflict spiral. So donors have responded to that largely by throwing money at the problem. So here we see some statistics of ODA, Overseas Development Assistance, from 2011 to 2014. And majority of ODA went to so-called fragile states. So those states that experience some type of governance fragility, and those states that are also either in conflict or are deemed likely to descend into conflict. Donors have also made this kind of normative shift where they're trying to use aid as a real incentive for peace, with the idea that aid is no longer just this instrument to buy favor of friends, but the way that aid is delivered, particularly in conflict-affected countries, should be used to incentivize good behavior and sanction or disincentivize bad behavior. So here are 4 kind of examples of this normative shift. One is a World Development Report in 2011. The next one is Goal 16 of the Sustainable Development Goals, which established among all member states of the United Nations that their development aid should not only focus on development, but it should also focus on trying to establish the preconditions for peace, justice, and strong democratic institutions. And the related New Deal on building peaceful states, an agreement between several conflict-affected states and several donor countries. And then finally, the Pathways to Peace report, a recent World Bank UN report that looks at the role of development and conflict prevention. So this is a very clear normative agenda. And in doing that, donors have kind of imagined that they can use their aid not just to deliver programs, but also to buy political influence, that either in the direct way that they give aid, through kind of conditionality, I give you this kind of democratic aid, and then you help to establish, these types of democratic institutions, but also that giving aid on the one hand may actually buy influence on the other, even if it's not directly related. And yet we have very little real knowledge about whether donors do have political influence. And if they do, when and how. And this diagram on the right is from DFID's 2009 Building Peaceful States report, which actually outlined a kind of comprehensive way that they hope to use their aid to build strong state-society relations by influencing the structure and the form and the functioning of public institutions. The literature on aid has not directly addressed this issue, and the kind of older literature on aid has really focused on all countries at the cross-national level without focusing in on conflict-affected countries. The peace-building conflict mitigation literature, for its part, agrees that any kind of intervention should be localized and adapted. It should be nuanced, and that aid can be used as an incentive or disincentive for violence and peaceful cooperation. But it doesn't actually assess systematically whether or not that takes place. And it generally treats all IOs, INGOs, and bilateral actors uniformly, and ignoring important heterogeneity in behavior. So these literatures are not integrated, and we don't have any kind of complete explanations of subnational behavior or influence of aid in conflict-affected countries. So the research question that Gabby and I started out here is we wanted to find out, do international donors influence the political behavior in conflict-affected countries, or do they have little real influence on the conflict and cooperative dynamics, regardless of what type of aid they give? And so what we developed, this is inductive from our results, but it gives a kind of frame of the findings here, is that you can think of the context, a conflict-affected context, as kind of going toward peace escalation and going toward violence escalation. And you can think of aid as being given through the government in the form of budgetary or development aid, or around the government in the form of humanitarian or transitional aid. And that in effect, the place of the trajectory, whether it was going toward escalation of peace or toward escalation of violence, and the type of aid actually determined the influence that our respondents perceived, right? So I'll point to just two important things here. One that was really interesting is that during times of escalating violence, when donors were giving aid through the government, both the implementers and the donors that we surveyed felt that aid could have an influence only if development aid was decreased, right? So not if it was increased, but actually if it sent a very clear signal that this kind of behavior would be punished in some way, this escalatory violent behavior. Whereas in peace, what you see is that in both the case of development budgetary aid and humanitarian transitional aid, there was the perception that when things are going better, that an increase in both of those types of aid actually begins to buy greater influence, right? The donors who are increasing in those areas have greater influence. And we have a whole kind of series of explanations as to why, but I want to move through this a little bit more. So the research design, it's a survey-embedded experiment administered to over 12,000 individuals in 180 countries, focusing on staff of bilateral and multilateral donors and implementing agencies. We had 8 treatment groups and we received 1,100 responses. This is just an overview of the responses. So we received far less from donors than from implementers. And in the donors, most of them were from multi-mandate organizations, which means that they considered themselves to be doing development, humanitarian, peace building, and or some kind of combination, right? So they weren't focusing on one singular type of aid, but rather they would have had knowledge about the multiple types of aid, which is quite important. And second, that the majority had also experienced the scenario that we gave them. And I'll get to the scenarios in 1 minute. This is the implementers. So 854 implementers responded to our survey and completed the full survey. And so you see most of them actually ended up being multilateral implementing organizations like the UN, but quite a few NGOs as well, and then some national NGOs. And yet again, they'd experienced the survey, and yet again, most of them consider themselves to be multi-mandate. The age was relatively evenly distributed. There were many more men than women, but the staff, this is quite important, the staff were both relatively equally international and national, which gives an important perspective because these two types of staff at the country level tend to have quite different perspectives. So we're happy to get both. So the treatment setup was in country A, we gave them a treatment of a particular country that they were operating in. So country A is a post-conflict country which means it has experienced civil war or significant armed violence. It has undergone a peace process and has held its first round of democratic elections. So everyone got this. And then they were assigned one of 8 treatments. And so the first one, you see top priority, not top priority at the top. This refers to whether or not the donor itself prioritize the recipient country as a top priority or not, right? And this kind of tries to get at a strategic interest variable. And then in line with top priority and not top priority, we got the respondents got one of 4 treatments. So a strong violence treatment, a mild violence treatment, a mild peace treatment, and a strong peace treatment. And we didn't give them the terminology of strong violence or strong peace. That's what we put on afterwards to categorize it, but gave them a relatively generic description of things getting better after a peace agreement or things declining. Then what we looked at essentially is, in your opinion, how would your organization's aid allocation behavior affect your organization's influence in country A? So first we asked them what we call here conditioning variables. We asked them, how would their aid change in country A, right? Would it increase, decrease, or no change in relation to development aid, humanitarian aid, budgetary aid, and transitional aid? And then based on their answers to that, did they believe that that aid allocation behavior would have increased or decreased influence on the politicians in the host government, essentially, on the policies and the political behavior of the recipient government? And so what we found generally is that in comparison, strong peace was our baseline. In comparison to strong peace, implementing agencies believe that both strong violence, in conditions of both strong violence and mild peace, donors would have less influence. Where donors themselves believe that compared to conditions of strong peace, they would actually have more influence in mild peace. So in the kind of immediate post-election phase. And this is really holds for each type of aid and across all types of aid as we go into it here. I'm not going to go into these details. But the conclusion is really that aid is perceived to influence the policies and behaviors of the recipient government, but not in the same way in all contexts. And this means that the relationship between aid and conflict depends on how donors actually engage with key windows of opportunity. And this is important in relation to kind of both larger studies of donor behavior, which don't get into the kind of nuanced interactions between donors in a particular context, particularly, and don't do that in conflict-affected countries, but also in relation to larger donor policies, which tend to assume that sustaining aid to a country and being involved over time actually will help them to achieve their aims. And this shows that if you sustain aid during certain points in time, it may undermine your aims, assuming that influence is related to your aims, but that if you are able to employ aid as a much more nuanced instrument, then you may actually be able to affect some of the political change that you desire to affect. Okay, I'm done.
Awesome, great. And with that, we'll open it up to our discussants. Suparna was able to join us. Welcome, Suparna. And Simone will not be able to join us. It looks like we have a lot of technical difficulty, but she has put together a document full of her comments, and we'll be sending them on to you guys. So with that, who'd like to start? Okay, Matt's up.
Sure. Since I'm incapable of saying anything without slides, I'm going to do a little screen share here. And I have a few things to talk about, but I also fear that my comments are truly comments, not questions, but hopefully comments that inspire responses.
I'm sure they are.
So I just wanted to start maybe then with the treatments here. Oh, did that? Is my screen being shared or no?
It is. We can see it.
It is. Okay. So the 8 treatments here, the top priority or not, and then the 3 ones that really seem to matter are the sort of assessments of the situation. Is there strong violence, mild peace, or strong peace? And so what strikes me about these is that they're not clearly on a continuum, and that they make you kind of different, what I'm calling assessment schemas for the respondents, so that the respondents might take different things out of each of the 4 different treatments. So strong violence is like very clearly a conflict situation, that they've been told about a post-conflict country and they're being told it's back at conflict. Whereas the mild violence language, for me, it actually cues something like state capacity in some way, or that the government is exerting force, and it's not this return to violence in the way that the strong violence says that the 2 sides are fighting. And then the mild peace wording gives a vague sense of kind of there's progress, there's some safety in the country, but it doesn't say much about government behavior or about behavior on the other side, on sort of a rebel group side. And then the strong peace treatment talks about a turnover in the government, and it talks about media and civil society flourishing. And so there's a very clear cue about non-governmental activity. And I think for me, it might be worth thinking about the sort of specific wording in each of the treatments a little more independently. And are we seeing responses to saying that NGOs are doing a lot, or saying that the government is exerting force? Because I'm not sure that they fit on this kind of 4-point continuum the way they get written down in the initial box in the paper.
Suparna, Gabby? I'm sorry, not Suparna. Susanna. You're muted. Okay, there we go.
Okay. Yeah, Matt, great point. I mean, I think that, and something that I think there are kind of 2 choices we're running up against here, right? One, do we take away this kind of escalation, this kind of continuum setup that we have in the paper? Or do we try to really justify the choice of these treatments much more clearly? And they are written to actually cue particular responses, right? In a sense that they're based on kind of typical cases within the broader peace building, aid and conflict policy schema. So I don't know what your suggestion is in terms of kind of framing it within the paper, whether we need to actually alter the continuum setup, or whether we can get away with that by just explaining it a bit better.
Muted.
Sorry, that's so dangerous. Let me make a quick additional point on one way that I think you might. This is more at the analysis stage still. I'm still going to have to wait for you to tell me what you want the 4 different scenarios to say. But with reference to the mild peace, I guess the way that I see that is it's the one that lets the respondents sort of insert their own perceptions to the greatest extent. So they're not learning about a turnover in power. They're not learning about the government asserting itself. They're not learning that we've gone back to full-scale violence. They're not learning that NGOs are really active. And this might be why you see a difference then in how the implementing agency respondents and the donor respondents react to this particular treatment. And so one analytical thing to do right there is maybe to use that one as the baseline category, and that might facilitate then the interpretability of the treatment effects. So rather than using the strong piece where they're getting some more concrete knowledge, that using the mild piece is just your control category for the other comparisons that you're making. It might facilitate your thinking on these grounds.
Gabby?
Yeah. Matt, so you think, I'm with you on that mild piece has the more, the most room for thinking about what happens here, but does that really makes it a good baseline category? I always thought it might make most sense to have those where we have the strongest idea of what is happening, the baseline category, which isn't, this is what we are debating within I mean, the two of us, whether it's really strong peace or strong violence that is the most clear in sense of what donors or implementers should do?
So if you're thinking of them as on a continuum, right, then choosing one of the endpoints makes sense. But if instead you agree with me that it's sort of, I've given you 4 different scenarios which don't necessarily fit on a continuum, then you could choose any. And the mild piece for me is the one that's the closest to sort of a true baseline. I gave you not particularly specific information, and now I'm going to compare 3 conditions where I gave you more specific information and see how you react vis-a-vis that other one.
Okay, I understand. Thanks.
Stephen, you want to try it?
Sure. I think another version of this comment that Matt made would be something that you see in some of the like audience cost experimental literature, where people will say the treatments are all double-barreled, or they're, in this case, kind of quadruple-barreled, and that they have lots of different facets. If it were me, my guess is that it's infeasible to try and redo things from the ground up, which is totally fine. So my instinct, I think, would go to Susanna's second option, which would be to describe kind of quote unquote canonical situations that donors find themselves in, and say, here are donors themselves and agents describing the key features as lining up with the things we're describing, or here are the examples you should have in mind, you the reader, not you the donor. Or I don't know if there is survey work from before where people look at what donors think are the hardest situations to deal with and the easiest, and if you can use that to inform the criteria you've got in the treatments. Or if there's existing empirical research that says these are the hardest and the easiest features and the variables that they use to describe effectiveness, and then use those to inform what you put in the treatments.
Oh, 2 fingers from Suparna. Oh, we can't hear you. And you don't look like you're muted. Sometimes turning the mute on and off makes a difference. No, try again. No. Damn. Okay. You can get off and then rejoin. Okay. Okay, so then Susanna and Gabby, do you want to respond?
Great points. I think that we need to look into them. I mean, and probably play around with both options, right? I mean, I think really looking at justifying them, but also beginning to think through what it would look like if we were to choose the mild piece as the baseline as well. So I think these are great suggestions.
Stephen.
In the survey instrument that you sent us, there were lots of open-ended boxes that followed outcome measures. Did any of those have ancillary information that you might use to say, the respondents seem to be really keying in on this feature of this treatment or that one?
A lot of them did, actually. So clearly not everyone, but there's a lot of information in the open responses that we need to really mine. But I was reading through quite a bit of it, and I think that it should be able to help us here. And that combined with, as you said, kind of what is understood as the canonical situations
Suparna?
as well.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, wonderful.
Okay,
Thank you.
great. So when Stephen was describing the point about canonical situations and how donors might be reacting, it sort of reminded me of some of my work on state persecution of NGOs, which basically fits your mild violence treatment. So there, I find that when states are persecuting NGOs, donors basically reduce the amount of aid, give it to less contentious causes, and give it to more domestic NGOs. So I can send you more detailed results about that, so that can help inform that category. But I was on the same page as them that I'm not sure it reminded me as much about mild violence as much as it reminded me about governments are cracking down on civil society, but other areas are functioning just fine.
Stephen on that.
Another place to mind would be all the booklets that you put in the presentation. I guess if there are lots of reports where they're saying these are the challenges, nay, opportunities we have for aid. What kinds of things do they identify as the main challenges and opportunities?
Susanna.
So because the problem, people are kind of hooking on this categorization as mild violence or strong peace, are labels. I mean, so the issue is, one, supporting the treatments themselves, right, with the booklets, and also thinking about different baselines. But two is this overall label. To what degree do you think that we should actually change that?
Matt, are you trying to get in on this?
Sure. So I think for me, right now, it's hard for me to say what the take home from the paper is. And I think part of that is, if you had sort of this obvious slope across the 4 treatments, it would be, aha, this is what donors do. Or if you didn't have on the mild peace treatment, the implementing agency respondents going one way and the donors going the other way, then there would be a more coherent narrative there. And so I think by maybe just I guess my idea was by reconceptualizing it as kind of, okay, we have 4 boxes that aren't necessarily on a scale, that maybe that will help you think through who's reacting to what, and in particular, why. So the treatment effect that you're estimating right now for the mild piece, remember, is being estimated against the strong piece. And so if you flip that around and you think of that as reaction to strong piece, is it that donors and implementing agents react differently to a turnover in government, to flourishing civil society life? And there might be reasons why we would expect donors to say, oh, that's great, and implementing agents to say, oh, no, that's competition. But you'll only do that if the baseline category gets flipped and if you're sort of not trying to do all 4 at once.
Stephen.
So I don't actually know that you can baseline yourself out of this problem, because the treatments are what the treatments are, and they've just got lots of different dimensions, and the baseline affects the interpretation of whatever we want to put up there for analysis of results. But at the end of the day, the proportion of people saying whatever for the respondents is what it is. So I'm a little hesitant about being able to baseline away the problem.
Sorry, Susanna.
Oh, but it's a presentation issue. I mean, that's essentially, right, that's what, in baselining away the problem, you're essentially altering how you present it. I mean, that's what I'm hearing here.
That there's not something wrong with the treatments themselves, but that instead the way that you guys are talking about it or framing them.
Right. I mean,
you're essentially saying that.
Yeah.
In the absence of a true baseline, right? So I think I take Stephen's point. My argument for why mild peace makes a good baseline is because it's the one with the least content, essentially. And so you can argue that it's the closest to what you would have gotten if you sort of had no description of the situation, maybe. But I think it's an argument. I think Stephen's point is still right, that it's, and your argument in the paper as to why you couldn't do a true baseline is also right. So it's a challenge. It is partially framing, but I think it's also, I think there's a logical argument to be made about some hierarchy or structure separate from the one that you currently have of these 4 points along the continuum.
Gabby?
I mean, but essentially there are 2 problems here that we're facing. One is the question of what is our baseline category, and we simply couldn't have done that without saying anything. So we had to provide them with some information. And that's the next thing why we introduced this multidimensionality, which is of course something that Stephen's completely right, is somewhat a nuisance. But at the other, I mean, we just had to provide them with some detailed information about how the world looks like for them. And this was, we tried to be as concise as possible, with at the same time giving them enough information. And of course, they are based on what we have, on our knowledge of reading all the booklets and stuff. So this is where we ended up. And I'm totally with you, Stephen. And probably it's the way out might be just to still choose another baseline category, and which might make it easier for us to find arguments out of the open-ended responses that provide us more of a understanding of why people responded the way they did. Or Susanna?
Yeah, I think both. I think both. Looking at what we have in the open-ended answers as actually clues, right? But they're, of course, going to be clues for whoever answered. And also really justifying these as these kind of categories which matter, right?
Good point. Oh, Matt.
So I'll move the conversation in a different direction towards thinking about the outcome variable, or at least the main, what you're currently using as the main outcome variable. The question about influence, and so it's either how would your organization's aid allocation behavior affect your organization's influence, or if it's an implementing agency respondent, how would your donor's aid allocation behavior affect your donor's influence? And so this is somewhere where I think these open-ended responses can be very informative. It struck me that influence could mean any number of things. So from the development perspective, influence may just be where projects are located, what types of projects they are, who gets to have the say about, is it development programming, is it humanitarian programming? Or influence is about changing behaviors and policies that are not directly related to programming. So stop being violent, stop cracking down on NGOs. And it wasn't obvious to me from the question wording alone how respondents would interpret this and whether they would take sort of the broad purview that Bueno de Mesquita and Smith or that other people in the aid literature take. In particular, I wonder if this is true for the implementing agency respondents. Like, how much do these people really think about donors trying to influence governments? And is this a possible explanation, as I was saying earlier, about why we might see different responses between the IA respondents and the donor respondents when it comes to that mild peace treatment or the strong peace treatment, if you want? Is it because they just don't think in these quid pro quo terms that maybe somebody in a donor agency does think about, or certainly the we political scientists think about? And also with this question, for implementing agencies, and I don't know how common this was, but one of the possibilities was that they say their funds come from private individuals or organizations. And so if a Save the Children employee says, oh, we're doing our programming because we have lots of private donors who are sponsoring children, then the outcome variable question here doesn't really make sense, because it's asking them to then think about how me, Matt Winters, Save the Children donor, is trying to influence the government of the country, or and so it's not necessarily clear how they would interpret the question if they had answered that previous question about where their funding comes from with reference to something other than a donor government.
Susanna.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is, so I think the question with this influence, with the influence question, it is very open-ended. And so the question therefore ends up becoming, is it actually, what is it capturing? And does influence, however interpreted, actually tell us something? And I think there is an interesting argument to be made that actually we know very little about influence in general, that influence might not fit the setup that I gave, right? The setup of, oh, they want to actually transform and make these more peaceful societies. They may just be trying to get somebody who they can partner with who can spend their money. So one thing that we've been playing around with is actually focusing really on the outcome variable as the shift in aid, because that's actually what we built the whole survey around. And then using the influence variable more in the kind of discussion section, right? To contextualize it, rather than actually focusing all of our energy on influence. And then that allows it to be a kind of an interesting narrative, rather than saying that we can actually show what leads to influence. Because the other issue is that in the way we do our analysis currently, we're not actually looking at joint influence. We're analyzing each of the types of aid separately. So I can't tell you, when donor increases this type of aid, decreases this type, increases this type, and decreases that type, that they have influence. And So a kind of question we had for you is if you had any other ideas about ways that we can analyze the aid allocation variable as well. If you agree with taking the influence variable and maybe using that to kind of situate our discussion of aid allocation rather than putting so much weight on that.
Steve.
I liked that where your instincts were going with that one. So one of the comments I jotted down was kind of, I didn't understand why the actual respondents' perceptions of what they thought they would do was kind of this secondary conditioning thing. I thought it felt kind of first order. And one other direction you could go with would be to say, kind of, are they right? Like if we look at giving patterns and implementing patterns, do they actually respond to changes in situations and conditions on the ground in the way that donors and implementers seem to think they are?
Suparna.
Yeah, I noticed the same tension throughout your paper. Like you started with, do international donors influence behavior in conflict-affected countries? But obviously your survey is about their perceptions on whether they influence behaviors. So I think it would be really cool if you could like add a link between the perceptions and actual policies. Like, do they actually overlap with each other? And if they don't, then what is messing up? Because clearly these people think that they should be influencing or allocating more or less aid, but then the organizations don't actually end up acting on that. So if you could add more on that on the framing and theoretical side, it could be quite a nice story on this is what we found, and then this is what doesn't happen.
I think that's such a cool idea, right? The sort of, here's what the field staff think, here's what the implementing partners think, and then here's what the donors actually do. And it's not that, right? Like that would be a paper.
I like it. Yeah, Stephen.
I think it's related to Suparna's comment, but when I was reading the intro and also seeing the presentation as well, I kept asking kind of why should I care about what the perceptions of these respondents are? Because the framing of does this stuff work doesn't match the research design and execution. So I wanted stuff where you said, all right, and here's why we should care about what they think they're doing. And then I would also add another way to upsell this is you can upsell it in the same way that like Hapner-Burton and others upsell the fact that they're surveying actual practitioners. So that may be a way to increase the appeal.
And at least,
yeah, go ahead, Suparna.
At least in part of the aid literature, there's this conception that aid patterns remain stagnant, especially from official aid donors. So you could show that, I mean, you are showing that these people don't think it should be stagnant. So there is like an important gap to fill there. And I could like send you some sites where they do think that it's stagnant.
So you're saying, and actually, what are you going to send as the data?
Oh, the stuff showing that, or stuff arguing that official aid patterns can be stagnant.
Right.
Whereas you're showing that these people don't think it should be stagnant. So then what's happening in that middle over there that might make them more stagnant?
I mean, we have geocoded aid data for Sudan,
Okay.
South Sudan, Nepal, and Congo. And so there's also
Okay.
an option of actually slicing.
Okay.
Even if we can do it, depending on how many respondents we have from these different countries, actually focusing in and comparing their responses with the actual behavior. And I don't know if we need to get that detailed or whether we could look at general patterns, right? And then use all responses. I don't know if anybody has any opinion on that.
Abby?
Matt, you said, so we should, I'm totally with you on what do the implementers think, what do the donors think. Then you said the field stuff. Is those working in the field, is that those working for donors in the field, you mean, or implement,
I guess I meant in both cases, right? So that you have people in the countries where activities are happening, and it's easy to believe that they have different ideas from somebody at headquarters or from somebody in the parliament that's actually passing a program that shifts budget support to project aid, right? That maybe the field staff doesn't actually agree with that, but it's what Congress decided to do. My other, I'd be interested to see some of the preferences broken down by the implementing agency respondents and the donor respondents. The implementing agency respondents should have a strong bias against budgetary support because it cuts them out of the equation. And so I'm just curious to know if that holds up in the data or not.
New point? Yeah, Stephen.
It's a new thread, but I wondered, to what degree should we worry that the survey instrument and the treatments give the respondent data about the trend in the country and effectiveness of what they're doing? Presumably all these people are doing something somewhere, and then we tell them this place that's receiving aid in whatever fashion from whomever is trending upwards or trending downwards. Even if they have kind of no understanding or beliefs about what's going on, the treatment tells them a little bit about the effectiveness of aid. So should we worry that the treatment just gives them, as potentially Bayesian type actors, some information about what aid is doing, and then that affects why and how they would change what they think aid patterns should do and whether they have influence?
Should I take this?
Yeah, sure.
It's an interesting question, Stephen. I think that what we can say is that the treatment gives them information about how the peace process is going forward. And if they think that aid is actually influencing the peace process, then maybe they would think that aid is working well. So I don't know how we can necessarily get at that. And I don't think in the treatments we actually set it up to say international donors have helped to support this peace process, right? It's just talking about the country itself. So they might have an idea that donors actually helped that. I think that what the treatments do is that it's clear that some contexts would be easier to operate in than others, right? If things are going well, then it's an easier operating environment. So therefore, we would expect that there would be increases in aid, and we would expect that there would be greater influence, right? Which is what we find, which means that that's not surprising. And as you said, it's only surprising if actually perceived influence varies greatly from actual behavior, right?
It looks like Gabby was getting in the queue.
So it should be, I see your point, and it could add to our multidimensionality of the treatment, yet only if we really analyze influence, isn't it? So if we just look at allocation patterns as we really originally framed this experiment for, I don't see, I'm mostly with what Susanna just said. And so the interesting part might be if we shift the focus more back again to our original outcome variables on allocation patterns, so both increase, decrease, but also we might want to take back our location, so we also know whether they would shift it to other parts of the country or whatever. I still would love to keep the influence in there, and I still not sure how to think about the combination of what they do with the aid and then how this could then influence the influence. But I see your problem with the influence, but I'm not sure I share your concern as much for the allocation. Or
Yeah,
you think that?
I think you're right. This applies mostly to analysis of the effects of treatment on perceived influence. I agree.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Suparna, do you have an endpoint?
Well, when I was reading this, so I might have missed this at the beginning, but at least in the paper, I feel like some points needed to be clarified more as you rewrite versions of this. So first, need to clarify the difference between a donor and an implementing organization. and especially because the paper is framed as like a broader question about donors. So then do you not use that language, or how implementing organizations are connected to donors? I think that needs to be clarified for people who don't know the difference, but also for the sake of how the question is worded. And the other thing I was wondering was, so if I'm not mistaken, you're looking at both private and official foreign aid, right?
We ask about aid donors in general. We have a question where we ask who their donors are, so we're able to differentiate between who's, yeah.
Okay, yeah, just because like some of the literature on like official aid talks about strategic reasons, but then there's this entire different literature on private aid, which is talking about humanitarian principles of aid. So Tim Butha's research in IO is looking at that. So in a way, your paper could connect those separate mini substrands together. So I think that could be a cool thing to do.
Anyone else? Yeah, Stephen. And then Matt.
So I raised my unmute clicking finger. Sorry for the delay. This is also about the experiment and the design. The paper emphasizes a fair amount why y'all think that the treatment setup and the experiment setup decreases desirability bias. But I wasn't sure I understood those arguments, because I'm asking someone about the effectiveness of what they do for a living. So I'm asking them what they do and whether they think it'll work, and people are probably disinclined to say this is what we do and it would fail. And potentially more problematically, that might vary across the type of actor you're surveying, because I could imagine a donor being less likely to say this is what we do and it would fail, whereas maybe a disgruntled field agent says, yeah, this is what we do and it sucks. And I should also say, while I think this is a potentially worrisome criticism, Gabby's original comment earlier that this applies to influence is probably, and not to allocation, is also appropriate here.
Gabby.
The last sentence was nasty, because I thought I had a good answer to this until you just came up with your last sentence.
No, I'm saying you do. You already do. I'm saying you do have a good answer to this.
Okay.
So now you have two good answers.
No, it's one. There's no additional. I mean, our problem, I think, with this version of the paper is we just got a little bit carried away by this influence, because we thought like, oh, cool, we see it. I mean, influence really is the end result of where we want to go. But the survey was really designed on aid allocation, and this is really where the social desirability bias comes in, because though both donors and implementers, out of maybe different reasons, might think they should answer if we just ask them, that they do react, although they might not react. And this is really where our idea of the experiment came from, just to get the real patterns out there. And yeah, so this all might make more sense again if we just go back to our original dependent variable.
Steven?
Even if we switch back to how the respondents think their agencies would respond, do you think that people would feel pressure to respond in a certain way? So if I said to them, things are getting worse, and whatever that means for your beliefs about influence, the situation on the ground is getting much worse, would people be more or less inclined to say, yep, we're going to pull out stakes because we can't hack it? Or do you think different types of actors would be more or less inclined to say, no, we're going to stay the course because this is the right thing to do. Check out our booklet. I could imagine there being variation across actors.
Can I go, Emily?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. No, I think that's actually what's fascinating, and that's a nice setup, right? Because what donor wants to say that they're not going to increase influence by spending money, because their incentives are to spend money. Their incentives are actually to spend more money. And so the whole setup is for donors to try to spend as much money as possible. and allocate that money through all 4 treatments. That's what their incentive structure is. So what's surprising is that they say, actually, we're only going to have influence by decreasing aid. In fact, that's one of the more surprising responses. So in that sense, in terms of the 2x2, the no influence and the influence through aid decrease end up being the more surprising outcomes, whereas we would expect under mild and strong peace that you would have, that they would think that they would have influence by spending money, and therefore they keep spending money and they're more effective. So that's a nice way of framing it, I think.
Matt.
So I guess where I would expect social desirability bias is that with any bad stuff, I think donors should think that they should say they would cut budget support, right? And so that I think the interesting tension is if there was somebody who really was thinking about this strategically, they would need much more information, but you wouldn't actually necessarily want to cut budget support if what you want the government to do is crush the rebels, right? Like, but you give them a sparse scenario so they can't really identify with the government or not, and maybe that pushes them to think in development terms. But it's possible to come up with a scenario where there is socially desirable answer is we should be cutting because violence is bad and the process is not working. But in a particular applied situation, the response might be, no, we need to keep funneling money to our side.
Suzanne?
Well, and this is, Mike Finley and I this project that Gabby and I are doing is also related to a book that Mike Finley and I are writing, where that's the kind of outcome is that what we're observing there is that you can't actually predict which increase or decrease will be effective for a donor's goals, right? So if you increase aid in the face of violent conflict, then you may actually incentivize rebels, and it may end up funding rebellion that you don't want it to fund. Whereas if you decrease it, it may not actually support kind of key local NGOs who are key to guaranteeing peace and stability in that context. So there's no kind of clear set of action that I think empirically donors should or should not take. And I think that's what's interesting about the strong results that Gabby and I find, is that still donors and implementers themselves are operating with these kind of mental models about what they should do. Now, whether that is effective or not, we can't answer. And so I think for Gabby and me in this paper, we have to figure out how to frame this in a way that it does have, what's the kind of biggest bang that we can get from the set of data that we have, pointing to what we can understand about perceived aid allocation patterns, the relationship to real aid allocation patterns, the relationship to influence, and then the kind of, well, does this matter? Is it just kind of pointing to discontinuity in how organizations operate, or is it actually pointing to something that we care about in terms of aid or conflict-related outcomes?
Matt, you had a new point.
Yeah, so I was gonna just to quickly go to looking at the sample and comment on. So you have half of the sample, I guess, coming from respondents in 5 countries, all of which are conflict-prone / post-conflict countries, and so that's probably helpful. And then on the other hand, half of the sample comes from just 5 countries, and so I guess awareness of what the implications of that are. I'm curious why Myanmar had so many potential respondents, and then its rate of responses is about the same. It seems that from eyeballing the data that you get about 1 out of 10 everywhere. And then Nepal had this much higher response rate where you got 1 out of 4 people. And so I was curious if you had any thoughts on why people in Nepal were so responsive to your survey. And then the US numbers, you got a larger response rate than the table seems to indicate you tried to get. And so I'm wondering if that's because people identified afterwards as being from the US where you hadn't thought them initially to be.
Gabby, did you have a finger up on this?
Sorry, yeah, I mean, you may have overlooked it, but the country with the best response rate is actually Austria, 2 out of 2, so everyone responded.
Looking at absolute numbers, not at the...
I mean, what this table though hides is, so it's where people currently are located. This is not, I mean, we probably have to see whether this also means that they are from this country. So it might be both people from Nepal and people working in Nepal, coming from other countries, having worked in other contexts. But it's definitely an issue we need to look into it.
Susanna.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we should show here is actually what conflict-affected countries have people worked in or on, which we do ask, right? But that's the relevant information because we want to understand from where are they actually deriving their perceptions, particularly if they say they have experienced this scenario. And so where have they experienced it? And that seems to be the more relevant information that we need to pull out.
Yeah, I mean, my point is you start, if those people are in those countries right now and they're thinking about those countries, you start with half your sample in 5 conflict-affected countries. So you're sort of in a good position for claiming that you have a relevant sample then.
Great, thank you.
Stephen.
This goes back a couple minutes to the theory discussion, but I kept waiting for y'all to say, here's what the literature says, or here's what we, the authors, theorize about when increases and decreases in aid are effective, and then how these different escalation climates or trends affect those conditions. And to that theory, I was wondering, do you think we should add an argument about whether this depends on the status quo amount of aid? So if I only give a little bit today, then threatening to remove it tomorrow is not going to do much regardless of conditions on the ground. Or if I give tons today, then promising to add to my total might have diminishing returns. So I just wasn't sure what mental model you thought either we as kind of social sciencey folks should have in mind about the effect of an increase or decrease on whatever outcome we want to influence, conditional on conditions. What model you thought we should have in mind?
Suparna.
And also on the point of the theory, in the empirics, you talk about top priority countries and not, but that's like completely missing from the theoretical discussion. So something more on how do donors prioritize countries, and then that's how that's affecting, donor likelihood of increasing or decreasing aid in your discussion in the theory section.
Susanna or Gabby? Susanna.
Gabby, did you have a response? Do you want to go after me? Okay.
Okay.
Yeah?
No.
Okay. So, Stephen, I mean, the issue is that in fact, their theory doesn't actually tell us, the aid literature doesn't tell us what we should expect, right? The conflict mitigation management literature begins to tell us, which was kind of the setup of you want to incentivize good things and discourage bad things. So, but I think that you're very right that we need to set it up so that we set up very clear expectations. And the thing is, they're kind of 2 contradictory set of expectations. One is based on if you're going to use aid to effectively manage violent conflict, what might it look like, right? And then the other set is, what do we know about patterns of of donor behavior, and therefore what would we expect? And those are actually those would result in kind of completely different theories, where we would expect donors to leave when violence comes and run away, because if their incentive is just to spend money, then why would they stay, right? Why would they continue to engage? Or we would expect donors to stay all along the way, particularly if they're development donors. So I think for me, the question is, there are many different levels and ways to slice this, and the more detailed we get, the more we can kind of dive into the details of the data, but then are we losing the kind of bigger picture that we have by looking across all different types of actors and all different types of donors? So to synthesize, I could tell a different story for development donors, for humanitarian donors, for peace building donors, for budgetary donors. But as we saw, a lot of the donors themselves are multidimensional. And so can we actually parse at that level, or is there a bigger story? I answered your question with a question.
Oh, sorry.
Just
Gabby,
this
and then
is also where the priority thing came in, where just Susanna gave us the example of if you have conflict and you may want to run away, but this might be different in a priority country. That's why we put that in. But you're completely right. We should, I mean, we need to theorize about this, and it shouldn't come out of the blue suddenly in the in the research design section. Completely right. But the real tension for us is a little bit how much, I mean, on both in the theory and in the empirics, we have so much details in the survey and stuff we can leverage upon. And it's finding the right balance on where to tell our story is something we're still trying to really find out and figuring out.
Yeah, Stephen.
I think a starting point might just be, under what conditions do we think an increase or a decrease or a threat to do one or the other has any effect? And then that can help set up, okay, here's what the modeler nerd says you should do if conditions change in this way. Here's what the literature says we think happens. Here's what the empirics say we think happens. And then here's our survey that says, here's what these people that actually do it think happens. But I feel like I was unclear on the starting point of what, like, why should I think an increase or decrease ever matters, or under what conditions? Because I just kind of think about this in principal agent terms. I'm the donor, I'm the principal, I got money, I want you to do something, so I write a contract. And whether you change your behavior is a function on how well I wrote that contract and how it affects your incidents.
Any new points? Okay, that's perfect because we're about to wrap up. So I want to thank so much everybody who joined us today. Thank you, Susanna and Gabby, for sharing this work with us. It was excellent and a great conversation. Thank you to Matt and to Stephen and to Suparna and also to Simone, who wasn't able to join us but did send comments, for reading it so closely and giving great suggestions. And I'm sure the authors really appreciate it. Our next meeting is next Monday, the 30th. Wait, is that next Monday? 2 Mondays from now. Sorry. April 30th, we have a presentation from Chaudhry, who is presenting a model of ethnic identity and relationships. So be sure to join us again. And if anyone's watching and would like to check this paper out, it's linked on our website, the online Peace Science Colloquium website. And we'll see you again soon. Thank you, everyone.